Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. We're just going to give a couple more minutes for other folks to jump on, and we're looking forward to a great discussion today. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to give it one more minute. We're seeing the numbers of attendees ticking up, and I'm Amy Hanauer from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. We'll get started in about a minute here. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Amy Hanauer. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, and we have a great panel of experts assembled today to talk to you all about conformity, which I wouldn't have thought was such an appealing issue, but we've gotten lots and lots of registrants for this webinar. So federal policy has changed in massive ways in like a very short amount of time across almost every policy area imaginable. And that definitely includes tax policy. Those tax policy changes are going to impact your state tax codes in significant, sometimes surprising, and almost entirely negative ways. And so we're just here to kind of tell you a little bit about that today. So the Trump tax bill passed this summer, the OBBBA, will give $1 trillion in tax cuts to the richest 1% of people in this country over the next decade. It's also been scored by the Congressional Budget Office as adding about $4 trillion to the national debt over the next decade. So despite this massive run-up in the debt, the bill actually slashes federal support on healthcare, on food assistance, on environmental protection, on a lot of the essentials that your communities rely on. And in many ways, they're expecting you at the state level to pick up the slack. But you at the state level do not have the luxury of running up trillions of dollars in debt. You have to balance your budgets, and that job just got harder. So a lot of you have maybe become a little bit accustomed to relatively easier budget times in recent years. But those are really coming to an end, and it makes it extremely important that your states craft a very thoughtful, forward-looking response to the federal changes. So step one needs to be a robust discussion of tax conformity. What that means is you have to decide how many of these tax changes passed by Congress are things you want to mimic in your state tax codes, and how many are things you'd rather skip and chart your own path forward on instead. These decisions over the next few months are going to impact your budgets for years to come. So it's really crucial that we get it right the first time, especially with the budget pressures expected to worsen in the years ahead. So we've got a phenomenal panel assembled to kind of help you sort it all out. So first, a couple of logistics. This is being recorded. And there will be time for questions. We encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A function. We'll try to monitor the chat, but that Q&A function is just a lot easier for for organizers to take a look at. If you don't get to your questions here, we will answer you by email. You can email amy@itep.org or John with no H, Jon@itep.org, and we'll make sure to get your questions answered, especially if you're from the press. Okay, so quick introductions of our great panelists. Aidan Davis is our state team leader extraordinaire here at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. And she and her team are just rolling out incredible tools for you all to use to clean up the mess the feds are making in your state tax codes. Michael Mazeroff is like the longtime smartest guy ever on many of these issues. He worked at the Center on Budget and Policy for many, many years and now continues to work there as a consultant, but generously agrees to be a board member at ITEP, for which we're really, really grateful. And Daniel Hauser is the Deputy Director of the Oregon Center for Public Policy, and he and his team have just done an excellent job of laying out why these issues need to be dealt with in your states. So I'm just thrilled to have all of them here, and going to turn it over to Aidan, who will kind of ground us in what's going on.
Thank you, Amy, and welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here. So as we're talking about how to best structure state tax policy, it's just really crucial to have some baseline understanding of how families' federal tax bills are changing because of the federal mega bill. So if we can go to the first slide. So here is an ITEP analysis done using our microsimulation tax model. It shows the same pattern as the official analysis published by Congress's Joint Committee on Taxation. What it shows is that high-income families are receiving the largest tax cuts under the federal bill, in part because of the tax rate cuts, but also from a variety of new business tax subsidies. So this top-heavy tilt is also apparent when you look at tax cuts relative to income, which means that the federal bill is what is known in tax circles as a regressive tax cut. We also have state-specific versions of this chart on our website that you might find helpful, and I think someone will drop in the chat for y'all. So how does the American public in general feel about this sort of thing? We can see on the next slide. So luckily, Gallup does a lot of polling on taxes. And one of their most striking findings is that just 12% of the American public thinks the rich are paying too much in tax today. 12%. When Gallup asked people the same question about whether corporations are paying too much, only 7% of people said yes. So the polling is really clear on this question, and we have just a vanishingly small fraction of people in this country saying that corporations and the rich are paying too much tax. And yet, despite that, we just witnessed the US Congress pass an enormous piece of legislation that dramatically cuts taxes even more for both of these groups. So what we have here is just an astonishing disconnect between what the public wants and what Congress has delivered. It's concerning, to put it mildly, but if I can just look on the bright side for a moment, it's also a fantastic opportunity for states to step up to the plate. So if we can move to the next slide. So there really is a genuine silver lining in this story. And that silver lining is that state lawmakers have a clear opportunity here to step up and lead and show the public that our elected officials are capable of steering public policy back in the direction that actually lines up with Americans' values. So what does that look like? Well, on the tax front, it's kind of twofold. So first, you shouldn't feel obligated to piggyback on this full grab bag of tax policy changes that just passed by this Congress. And for the most part, a lot of the tax bill was misguided, tilting in a regressive direction overall. And in the estimation of both left and right-leaning groups, making the individual tax code considerably more complex. And then second, you can be thinking about more proactive steps that go beyond just these conformity questions. So that can mean, for example, clawing back some of the very large federal tax cuts that are flowing to wealthy families against the public's wishes by enacting progressive tax measures at the state level that are really designed to balance out what we just saw unfold federally. And the case for doing that is going to grow stronger in the months and the years ahead as new state budgetary challenges around Medicaid and SNAP and a potentially slowing global economy really begin to mount. All right, move to the next slide. So you can only do all of this, though, if you're willing to head deep into the weeds with us. And that's because that's where these policy changes are going to happen. And we'll try to guide you through as best we can. For today, we're going to be tackling 8 main categories of tax changes. some of which you may know about, but others I suspect are flying a little bit more below the radar. So Michael's going to be handling the business side with insights on provisions affecting depreciation, opportunity zones, tax subsidies for research and development, and the newly named corporate tax break on FDII. And then I'll walk through the individual side, covering changes to SALT deductions, the exemption for so-called qualified small business stock, the expansion of 529 accounts for education, and tax cuts for tips and overtime. Can you move to the next slide? I'll then turn it over to Daniel, who will give us a sense of how this is playing out on the ground in Oregon. And he'll be talking about the revenue at stake in his organization's push for a really strong response to the federal bill. But first, as you know, I did ask you guys to get into the weeds a little bit with us. So I'm going to start by really briefly explaining the ways in which states connect or conform to the federal tax code. And typically states couple with rolling fixed or selective conformity. So if we can move to the next slide. When states automatically follow the version of the Internal Revenue Code in effect for the current tax year, that is referred to as rolling conformity. And these states tend to be at high risk of incorporating new federal tax cuts into their own laws because doing so happens automatically rather than through a vote of the legislature. On the other hand, when states conform as of a specific date, that's referred to as static conformity. And state legislatures often update these static dates after considering what those updates are going to mean for tax policy in their states. And then finally, states with selective conformity see a more limited degree of connection to the federal tax code, with conformity to some provisions, but not to others. And then states also use different starting points for their definitions of income. Next slide. And this is really the foundation of any personal income tax code. So depending on these and other factors, different policies will affect states differently across the country. And those factors are really going to matter a lot in determining which policies flow through to your state and how much of a revenue hit your state will see if you don't act swiftly. And then really, really notably, many of the problematic provisions that we're going to cover here today and talk you through are retroactive to 2025. So what that means is that you need to really make some decisions and get these cleaned up this year or in the first couple weeks of January so that you can have the right rules in place by the time your 2025 tax forms are made available to your state's taxpayers. And with that, Michael, if you will, please go ahead and walk us through these business tax changes.
Sure. Thanks, Aidan. Next slide or first slide, please. So the OBA contains a large number of corporate tax breaks, but I'm going to talk about 5 of the sort of most costly ones, the most egregious ones, the ones that should really be the highest priority for states to decouple from. And just those are providing for the immediate write-off of the cost of machinery, equipment, and factories, the immediate deduction of research and development expenses, a relaxed cap on the deductibility of interest, a permanent extension of the Opportunity Zone program, and a deduction for what's called foreign-derived intangible income. Next slide. And these tax breaks are really, really costly. As Amy said, states with their balanced budget requirements and all the hits they're taking from cuts in Medicaid and SNAP and other federal assistance programs really, really can't afford to stay coupled to these provisions. I have here just a few examples from 3 states of the estimates that the states themselves have done of the cost of conformity with these provisions. And these estimates in some cases don't include all 5 of the provisions I'm going to be talking about because the state was already decoupled. So for example, Michigan just enacted a bill yesterday that decoupled from 3 of the provisions I'll be talking about to save $540 million. But if they had been coupled to a couple of the others, they would have lost even more. Next slide, please. And leaving aside the cost of these provisions in terms of foregone revenue and the fact that many of them have very questionable policy justifications to begin with, and by that I mean it's not clear that the things that they're trying to incentivize actually are being incentivized from the provision. When you look at the state level issue of conformity, there's sort of a common thread or a common rationale that runs through all 5 of these provisions as to why states shouldn't conform to them. And that arises basically from the way that state corporate taxes work. States tax a share of the nationwide profit of multi-state corporations. In other words, you take the nationwide gross receipts of the company and you subtract the nationwide deductions, and then that's the nationwide profit, and states tax a share of that. And as a result of that approach, failing to decouple from these provisions means that states may very well be foregoing vitally needed revenue to incentivize investment and R&D and the other things that these provisions are trying to incentivize without any direct benefit to their own economies, because all the activities might be occurring in other states. So all 5 of these provisions have that characteristic, as does another one that Aidan will be talking about shortly. So next slide. So the first provision is really, the first policy issue is really embodied in 2 provisions of the bill. We're talking here about taxing corporate profits. If you're going to tax a corporation's profit, you have to allow the company to recover the cost of their initial investment in their plant and equipment. Otherwise, you're really not taxing their profit. So the law allows annual deductions for depreciation, which is a partial write-off in each year of the cost of their investment in property, plant, equipment, land, and so on. And in theory, those deductions should be spread over a time frame that reasonably matches the useful life of those assets. But our tax law has long allowed various forms of accelerated depreciation, which means allowing companies to bunch those deductions for depreciation in the early years with the aim of incentivizing investment. Next slide, please. So OBA permanently restores what's called 100% bonus depreciation that has been enacted at various times in the past, particularly during recessions, to incentivize increased investment. And what 100% bonus depreciation means, sometimes called expensing, is that the write-off of the full cost of the machinery and equipment occurs in the very first year that machinery equipment is placed in service. And so, as I said, OBA now allows permanent 100% expensing or bonus depreciation. It also provides a new temporary 100% write-off for manufacturing plants. Up to now, bonus depreciation has only applied to machinery and equipment and not to the actual building itself. And the OBA provides a temporary 100% write-off for manufacturing plants. So the good news is the large majority of states have long decoupled, like from the very first time that bonus depreciation was allowed from it, due to both the cost and the issue that I discussed earlier of the fact that if you allow bonus depreciation, you may be foregoing revenue to subsidize investment that's occurring in other states. So for both those reasons, the large majority of states have always been decoupled from bonus, but the recommendation now is for all states to decouple. If your state is not decoupled from bonus depreciation, you should do it ASAP. That's probably the most expensive provision of OBA. Next slide, please. The second very expensive provision has to do with the write-off of research and development expenses. Prior to the 2017 Trump tax bill, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, corporations were allowed to deduct research and development expenses in the year in which they were incurred. And the 2017 bill switched that to a 5-year write-off. And that made sense because just like with buying a piece of equipment, the investment in R&D pays off over time, so it makes sense to allow the deduction for the cost to be written off over time. OBA proposes to restore the pre-TCJA provision and allow immediate write-off of R&D expenses, and it also has a provision that restores this one-year write-off retroactively to 2022 for small and medium-sized businesses. And that provision makes no sense whatsoever. It's just a pure windfall. You can't incentivize investment in years that have already transpired. So again, the recommendation is that all states should retain the 5-year write-off that was in TCJA, and it most certainly not provide retroactivity. Next slide, please. This wasn't on Aidan's initial slide, but I just wanted to stick it in because it's also another costly provision. For the first time, TCJA imposed a cap on the ability of large corporations to deduct interest on their bonds and other debt, and it placed a limit on the deductibility of interest of 30% of taxable income. A 2021 law made a technical change in how that taxable income for purposes of the cap was calculated, and it had the effect of tightening the limit. And OBA proposes to restore the more generous TCJA provision. So the recommendation is here is that all states that coupled to the limit back in 2021, the tighter limit, should retain that provision, and the majority of states that never coupled to it to begin with should start coupling to the limit. Next slide. The fourth conformity issue in OBA is the permanent extension of the so-called Opportunity Zone program. As I'm sure many of you are aware, TCJA created this new program. It provided 3 different kinds of capital gains tax breaks for capital gains that were rolled over into Opportunity Zone funds. Those capital gains could come from anywhere: the sale of stock, the sale of real estate, even the sale of a house potentially. So if those capital gains were rolled over into Opportunity Zone funds, they were eligible for 3 different tax breaks. And these Opportunity Zone funds would invest in real estate developments and businesses in depressed areas and neighborhoods in theory. The most costly of those 3 tax breaks was a permanent exemption from capital gains tax of gains from the sale of those Opportunity Zone projects held for 10 years or more. And there's considerable evidence that's accrued since the beginning of this program that these funds have not really created permanent jobs in low-income areas to any great extent. They've mostly invested in kind of luxury real estate projects and gentrifying neighborhoods, and really not fulfilling the goal of the program. So next slide, please. So anyway, OBA permanently extended the Opportunity Zone program, which was to have been temporary and expired at the end of 2026. That is, no new capital gains could be rolled into Opportunity Zone funds after the end of 2026, although the Opportunity Zone funds themselves would continue. But to the extent that Opportunity Zone tax breaks are incentivizing some worthwhile projects, and they are, that's being driven by the federal tax breaks. There's no need for states to layer on their own. And again, most of these Opportunity Zone funds they're either investing in projects all across the United States, or they're investing on a regional basis. And again, meaning that if your states conform to this program, you will be losing revenue from residents of your state or corporations that are present in your state, making Opportunity Zone investments in other states that doesn't benefit your state economy as well. So I wrote papers when I was at the center all the way back in 2018, saying that all states should decouple from Opportunity Zone tax breaks for that reason. Very few did. And now that this is a permanent program, that's even more reason for states to permanently decouple from the program and the capital gains breaks that it provides. Next slide, please. And then finally, like the Opportunity Zone issue, this is another decoupling issue that really isn't new. but it's something that states should have decoupled from the beginning. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act created a new category of profit called foreign-derived intangible income. It was basically sort of a carve-out of a share of corporations' existing profits that was deemed to be attributable to foreign sales of goods and services embodying intangible assets like patents and trademarks that were held within the United States. And it's turned out to be far more costly than originally estimated. And so under this provision, corporations calculate a share of their profit that is deemed to be FDII, again, attributable to foreign sales, and they get approximately a 40% deduction. It's actually 37.5% deduction of that FDII off the top. In other words, the FDII is taxed at a substantially lower tax rate than the normal 21% rate. And this was intended to incentivize companies to develop their intangible assets and do their R&D that results in patents in the US. And it was also intended to encourage them to repatriate to the US trademarks or patents that they might hold abroad. Next slide. So OBA didn't really fundamentally change the FDII program. It actually made it deduction. It actually made it a little bit less generous. It renamed it. It's now called Foreign Derived Deduction Eligible Income. But nonetheless, the minority of states that are not already decoupled from FDII should now take this new opportunity to decouple immediately. There's no guarantee that any of this R&D activity, marketing, and so on is going to actually occur in the US, but states not decoupled are going to lose a lot of revenue. Next slide, final slide of mine. So just as sort of an overarching comment here, we think you need to press your state revenue department to report on a provision by provision basis which OBA provisions that I've talked about you're coupled to. As I said, many states are already decoupled from some of them. You need to press as well for a provision by provision estimate of the revenue loss from being coupled or the revenue gain from decoupling. Folks at ITEP and I can help you determine if from your statute if you're coupled, but it's not always easy. So ideally, your state itself is going to do a report, and many states already have, on which provisions they're vulnerable. Thanks, and I'll kick it back to Aidan.
Hey everyone, so I'm going to start with the expansion. Oh, sorry, can we do next slide? I'll start with the expansion of the tax exclusion for qualified small business stock, also known as QSBS. So this exclusion is allegedly aimed at helping small business, but in reality, it's a giveaway to venture capitalists, plain and simple, and it's doing nothing to help foster real economic growth in the states. This is similar to a lot of the policies that Michael was talking through on that point. So this tax subsidy has quietly ballooned over the years, and it's really flown under the radar in a lot of ways. The way it works is that early stage investors and startups, typically in the tech sector, get to invest in companies on the ground floor and then cash out their stock holdings totally tax-free down the road. So this is a tax break that most Americans just can't access because you can't qualify if you try to invest in these companies through your retirement accounts or your brokerage accounts. You need to have an inside track with the companies themselves. A recent bombshell report by the US Treasury revealed that QSBS is far larger and far more regressive than many of us have expected. One thing that report shows is that 94% of the tax exclusions are going to households with over 1 million in annual income. And again, these aren't the kind of folks people think about when they hear the phrase small business. On top of that, under the new federal law, QSBS has now been expanded even further. And according to our analysis just out last week, those three changes are going to increase the cost of the provision by about 50% over the course of a few years. So if you can move to the next slide. So this policy has pretty far-reaching impacts across the country. 38 states are already conformed and are actively losing revenue. And with the new expansions, that revenue loss is going to drastically increase. From the perspective of federal policy, the subsidy is misguided. It's gotten a lot of flack, not just from folks on the left, but also from analysts at the conservative American Enterprise Institute. But regardless of what you think of it as a federal policy, it's clear that this is just nonsensical approach to state policy. The reason is companies that state residents are investing in likely aren't even located in that state. So someone in Maryland, for example, can claim a QSBS subsidy for investment they make in a California tech company and then cut their state tax bill, even if that investment produces no economic value to Maryland whatsoever. So it's just not a sensible way to set up your state tax code. Can we move to the next slide? So next up, we have the increased cap on state and local tax or SALT deductions. So back in 2017, Congress passed a law stopping taxpayers from writing off more than 10,000 of state and local taxes when filling out their federal forms. This was called the SALT cap, and it didn't sit well with lawmakers in states choosing to levy more robust tax levels because it meant that their residents were losing a pretty significant federal tax break. And so this year, a handful of lawmakers from states like New York and California said they weren't going to sign off on the federal mega bill unless that $10,000 cap was increased. And that's exactly what happened, with the cap rising to $40,000 for these next few years for most taxpayers. Now, at the state level, the way that this works is that states often offer their own kind of SALT deductions that are patterned partly after the federal rules, but they do it only for property taxes and not for income and sales taxes. And so with that higher cap, a lot of states are now at risk of offering much larger property tax deductions than they've become accustomed to providing. And it's really hard to make the case for prioritizing this at the state level. We know that property tax affordability has been an issue in states all over the country, and lawmakers are looking for ideas to offer property tax relief. But frankly, this is one of the worst and least targeted forms of relief imaginable because it's totally inaccessible to most taxpayers, and it offers the largest tax breaks to people in the most expensive homes. So this is not at all geared toward the people who are actually struggling with their property tax bills. You move to the next slide. So there are 18 states where we're particularly concerned that the cap could be inherited into state law. And that would come at quite a high cost. So my advice is to skip this break entirely and preserve that revenue. And if you want to do some kind of property tax cut, there's better options available. You can look to a circuit breaker instead, for example. And a final thought on this, if you do want to tackle this issue, you'll need to act fast because that $40,000 cap is retroactive to 2025. Next slide. So next I'm going to touch on 529 accounts. And what these are is they're tax advantage savings accounts that were initially envisioned as a way of improving college affordability by helping families save toward the high cost of college. But over the last several years, we've seen these programs basically hijacked by private school boosters in Congress with changes that fundamentally alter their purpose. Throughout their history, people choosing to save money in these accounts could withdraw their investment returns tax-free as long as they were using them to pay for qualifying educational expenses that are incurred after a student graduates high school. But in the 2017 tax law, they included a provision which only barely squeaked through the Senate that drastically expanded 529s so that account holders can use them to pay for private and religious K-12 schooling instead. So at that time, that expansion was limited to $10,000 of tuition expenses per year. But now under the mega bill or OB3 or whatever y'all are calling it, that's been doubled to $20,000 per year so that wealthy families can use these accounts to send their children to elite academies. So here's the thing. I mean, this expansion is wasteful to the core. On its face, the transformation and the way that the policy has changed is supposed to steer more families out of the public school system and into private schools instead. But it's not even good at doing that because these accounts are so overwhelmingly held by more affluent families who can already afford to send their kids to private schools. So if there's any good news here, it's that this is an easy policy for states to just completely jettison from their own tax codes. A sizable group of states, 9 in all, have decided that subsidizing private K through 12 schooling is not something they're interested in doing with these accounts. And so they've designated withdrawals done for that purpose as non-qualified expenses at the state that the state will tax. So this is just a very natural moment for more states, especially those where lawmakers are concerned about the trajectory of public education in this country, to take a stand and say that this isn't something they want to go along with. And our recommendation here is really simple. States with income taxes that have not already decoupled should use this moment to do so. Can you move to the next slide? So there's a lot more in this bill we could cover, but I'd like to conclude by briefly talking about the new tax carve-outs for tips and overtime income. So first I want to clarify, because I think there's been some confusion here, that these policies do not impact federal adjusted gross income, or AGI, only taxable income. So what that means is that most states are not affected by this federal change, aside from a half dozen or so, unless they actively choose to bring these carve-outs into their tax codes. So aside from that, I'd like to acknowledge that we're seeing lawmakers on both sides of the aisle really flock to these carve-outs, not because they're good policy, but because they think that the political winds are blowing in favor of these things. And if I may, I just want to challenge that conventional wisdom here with y'all today. So for the tip exemption, it really comes down to this. Why should lawmakers adopt a policy that gives bartenders special treatment over home health aides, childcare workers, and just lots of other people who are working really tough, low-paying jobs? When you think about tax principles, this very blatantly goes against the basic idea of fairness, which tells us that people in similar circumstances should pay similar tax bills. And I'm concerned that over time, if we set up a two-tiered system where people in some professions pay income tax and people in other professions don't, you're going to risk breeding a whole lot of resentment, and the popularity of these policies could wane. But it's problematic in other ways as well. There's the loss of revenue when states need to be thinking really seriously about protecting revenue. And then also these policies add significant complexity to the tax code, which we've seen pointed out by groups on both the right and the left. They encourage new tax avoidance techniques by providing special treatment to very specific types of income, which we're sure to see grow as workers and their employees rush to reclassify their income as tips. And then real quickly, as for overtime tax carve-outs, there's a crucial case study out there in Alabama that's just really worth being aware of. So their lawmakers recently opted not to extend a temporary policy that broadly exempted overtime pay after the true cost of that policy ended up being far higher than expected. So ultimately, so much, especially the cost, ends up hinging on how dramatically employers shift their behavior to exploit these carve-outs. Now, none of this is to say that people working in low-wage professions should not be a focus of our policy efforts. There are just much better options available to get there. And frankly, the no tax on tips and the no tax on overtime are more gimmick than solution. And I'd just like to challenge you all to rise to the occasion and find a way to do something better. And with that, I'll turn it over to Daniel to tell us about how these various debates are shaping up in Oregon and how he's thinking about options for moving forward.
Thank you, Aidan and Michael, for the terrific presentations. I learned something new every time I hear you both speak. So I'm going to step away slightly from the tax details and talk about what's going on here in war-ravaged Oregon. There are a few pieces of context that are important for folks to know about our state. So we're one of the most dependent states in the nation on personal and corporate income taxes. Since we don't have a sales tax and our Constitution restricts our property taxes, which is another good presentation we should have in the future, we end up just very dependent as a state on our income tax system. And we also here in Oregon just finished our 2025 legislative session days before HR 1 was signed into law. And it was a really tough budget year even before the impacts of HR 1. roll in to the implications of our budget. We had $100 million plus cut from our emergency rent assistance programs, tens of millions of dollars cut from our early learning programs. I mean, it was really bad before HR 1 was signed into law. And in Oregon, we use the rolling reconnect at federal taxable income. That means you'll notice in a lot of those maps that were popping up, Oregon was the wrong color. And that means the sort of aggregate of all of those different connections leads us to, what's right now estimated to be about $900 million in revenue that was in the hard budget we just passed that is no longer in the budget today. So a tough budget just got way tougher. And, we expect that impact will top billions over the coming years, particularly if Congress renews things like TIPS, overtime, auto loans, things of that nature. So next slide, thank you. Oregon has historically been very proactive and successful at embracing federal match programs, like on the spending side, and expanding those partnerships, right? Be it Medicaid opportunities, waivers, whatever we can find to get more federal match into the state. So this new shift, not just with HR 1, but certainly with HR 1, but of federal government stalling, holding back, canceling federal funding to state programs in Oregon just is hitting very hard, I think, here in our state. So to give you a sense of what we're talking about, the state government forecasts the spending impacts of HR 1 to be about $15 billion over the next decade, right? And the vast majority of that comes from Oregon's Medicaid program, the Oregon Health Plan, and SNAP. So they are already guessing in our current budget period, there'll be an additional $1 billion in Oregon's in new spending the state will have to come up with just to maintain our Oregon Health Plan and our SNAP programs. And that doesn't even include the new costs of hiring new staff, redoing IT systems to review eligibility every 2 weeks or whatever it is now. So if we combine the revenue and the spending impacts from HR 1, it's just a really bad deal for the state budget. Next slide. So thanks to the folks on this call, as well as other partners at the Center on Budget and other state groups, some of which are on this call too. This didn't come as a complete surprise, right? We've been working with lawmakers to try and address this preemptively all throughout our long legislative session that ended a few months back. As you've heard, many of these provisions, though, they kick in immediately or retroactively. And because we have a part-time legislature, it's hard to respond in a timely manner if we're not in session, which we're not right now. So we were successful at getting the House to pass a static connection bill that would have shifted us from a rolling reconnection to a static connection, but we couldn't quite get the Senate to do the right thing, and the bill ended up dying, leaving us connected to many of these egregious 2025 tax year revenue losers. So we then pivoted to calling on lawmakers to convene a special session to shift to static. But unfortunately, they were distracted by some other Oregon unfinished business. There was a significant transportation funding package that had been years in the works that fell apart in the last days of session. And so, while the governor of Colorado was focused on, just as an example, focused on calling a special session to address HR 1, our governor was focused on calling a special session to address our transportation funding issues. And that's what they ended up doing, right? We had a special session here in Oregon in late August into September that passed a transportation funding package, but they were too distracted, I guess, weren't able to, walk and chew gum. And so we did not have much success in getting traction on a special session to address the impacts of HR 1. We also have a little bit of a frustrating dynamic here in Oregon where if you pass a revenue bill, you can't put an emergency clause on it. So basically, it takes 90 days from the point of signature for it to be implementable, for the Department of Revenue to actually do something with that legislation. And so we're already at this point running up pretty close to the filing deadlines or the start of filing season if we were to get a special session right away. So we are trying to work through sort of just strategically and practically how much we can try and still get in a special session and how much we're in Oregon starting to shift our focus more towards the short legislative session that we have in February. We have a part-time legislature, so it's 6 months in odd years, 1 month in even years, and that's coming up in February. But we are always trying to remind these lawmakers in these conversations of the bigger context, right? We're having this conversation because we have inequality in corporate profits at historic highs, right? We have working families struggling. And then we have tariffs that are increasing the cost of goods for working families too. And we lay over top of that context, HR 1's really problematic increases in expenses for our state and these billions over time in revenue losses due to our rolling reconnect. And we're really trying to make it clear to them that they have a choice, right? Do they want to cut hundreds of millions of dollars in programs, or do they want to address some of the rolling reconnects and recoup some of those revenues? So we also often see the assumption that Oregon's because we have democratic controls of both chambers and the governor's mansion, it should be kind of easy for us to do. And unfortunately, a lot of those seats that swung Democratic to get a majority are quite swing district-y, quite socially liberal, fiscally conservative. Might sound familiar to some of you other folks in blue states. And so any tax increases is really hard fought here. But as I mentioned, Colorado, we have been trying to learn from their model a little bit as well, where we can really focus in on how can we raise hundreds of millions of dollars with a really focused message around going after corporate tax breaks or going after rich investors and making sure that they're the ones that are helping to share in the harm caused by HR 1, not just low-income families who are trying to get access to medical care or find a way to put food on the table. So something else that I think might be interesting to other states around, I think Colorado's that I found really compelling too, is that they were looking not just at HR 1, even though HR 1 created the crisis, on what they were looking to disconnect from. So we've done something similar here in Oregon in our conversations, is we're looking at stuff that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act created that HR 1 maybe only slightly touched on the edges on, right? Some of the things that Aidan and Michael presented on, I think foreign derived intangible income is a good example of this, where it got tweaked a little, right, in HR 1. But that's something that was created, right, in Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And that's something that we're hoping we can see lawmakers make progress on disconnecting from. So, while I wish we had been in a place of just completely moving to a static connection during long session, during a special session, with where we are now, I think we're really trying to think more about staying rolling reconnected, but having more of a selective disconnect, right? So we're talking about the qualified small business stock exclusion, opportunity zones. We're talking about bonus depreciation, research and experimentation expenses, FDII, as I mentioned. And I think there are some others like auto loan interest and salt cap tax breaks that don't fit that corporate message quite as cleanly, but we're also thinking through how are those also ways that we can help, fill this very large hole that our state's facing. So I'll say OCPP, and I'll put it in the chat, or maybe John can send it out to folks who registered afterwards. But we've put out a few different papers really explaining why these policies are so problematic. We have one on tax breaks for tips and overtime are crumbs for the working class, right? Falling off the table of the rich people and corporations that have seen such enormous tax breaks. And we have another on 6 ways we recommend folks disconnecting that builds a lot on the work that's been put in here. And we also have been talking about disconnect and the tax implications on our radio show and podcast Policy for the People. In case folks would like to check that out, we can also drop that in as well. So yeah, it's a lot of information, and a lot of context, so folks can kind of get a handle on where things are at here in Oregon. But hopefully, it's been useful, and I'm happy to answer questions now or later. But I'll turn it back over to Amy.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a lot of amazing content, you all, and we will be sharing the recording. We will be distributing the slides, so you'll have a chance to kind of go back over some of that meaty content. I did see one question in the chat that asking, Maryland's official estimates say that various bonus depreciation and similar provisions will increase revenues in the 2030s since the expensing is front-loaded. Does anyone, Michael, maybe have a thought about that?
Well, it's definitely true that with both depreciation and expensing, if you bunch the deductions in early years, in later years they're lower than they would otherwise be. But the fact of the matter is states are really particularly in trouble now. And with the bonus depreciation, the JCT score shows it losing revenue all the way through the 10-year window. So it's still really a high priority to avoid those things now. And again, it's not just a revenue issue. It's not just a revenue loss issue. It's the issue that you're losing revenue to subsidize activity that may not be benefiting your state one iota.
Yeah, that's great. That's a very clear explanation. A second question I saw was among the big 5, these 5 big tax breaks for business investment, do they all reward companies for investments in other states, or is that just only true for the opportunity zone provisions? And I think this is again a Michael question.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true of all 5 of them. And as Aidan pointed out, it's also true of the small, the qualified small business exemption. I mean, potentially, in theory, you could be giving it to businesses that are that are doing all this activity in your state. But the likelihood is that, these are nationwide corporations, and your state is only a small share of the national economy. So almost inevitably, you're going to be losing a lot of revenue associated with incentivized activity that is, again, theoretically incentivized activity, because there's a lot of evidence that's not really, these aren't doing much, but you're losing revenue associated with activity that's not going to be occurring in your state, a substantial share. It's true of all of them.
Great. Okay, thanks. Does anyone know if it would be unconstitutional to limit bonus depreciation only for investments in the particular state doing that?
Well, there are two court cases that I'm aware of that found that. So yeah, that's the assumption, and it's a reasonable one.
That's great. Okay. I think, let's see, the questions are coming in fast and furious. I think I lost track of one of them, but Aidan, you want to say a little bit about how many states have successfully decoupled a little bit, and we're going to be distributing some resources about some of this, but Aidan, do you have more you could say about that?
Well, I wish I had more to say, and that's part of the reason we really want to do this webinar. I think it's something that we really encourage states to work on and get ahead of. But to date, on the individual side, which is where I'm focusing today, it has been very limited. So Michael might have more to say, but on the corporate side, there's been some decoupling. I guess Michigan and Rhode Island are the two that are coming to mind for me. And then there's been some tax changes in Colorado that have helped raise revenue as a result of the federal bill. So Michael, I don't know if you want to say anything about Rhode Island or Michigan.
As I said at the beginning, Michigan just signed the bill yesterday. The governor just signed the bill in Michigan yesterday, and Michigan decoupled from bonus depreciation the relaxation of the deduction for interest and the R&D. So that was a really positive development. It doesn't seem to have been terribly controversial there. So that politically controversial, and that was also a good sign.
Great. Okay, thank you. Let's see, these questions are kind of coming in fast and furious, but there was a question about whether we foresee any impact on local property taxes as a result of OBA. Does anyone have something to say on that? Sounds like you stumped our panel. No, Aidan will not let that stand.
Yeah, I know you went off too. Do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, on first blush, for us here in Oregon that has constitutional limits on our property tax system, I can't imagine there being very robust direct impacts, because we have a weird circumstance where our the rate of assessed value is capped at 3% growth year over year. And if you know anything about Oregon's housing market in the last 30 years, it's gone up faster than 3%. So even if there was some impact on it, people trying to pass new property taxes, take advantage of the larger SALT cap would be one of my only ideas. They can't. So so it's hard for me, in terms of direct property tax revenue impacts. Certainly the state will be out more money because they'll be, able to deduct more of their property taxes from their state income taxes here in Oregon. That's probably the only impact I can, at least not pretty roundabout impact I can come up with.
Yeah, and I had a really similar response. I think the direct impact isn't really coming to mind for me, but I would say the revenue loss as a result of the broader bill, which Amy kind of talked about at the beginning, is going to flow through to all levels of government, and states and localities are going to be resource strapped. And so I can see that, like I said, it's kind of like the conversation around states and localities are going to have to be talking about raising revenue. So it may impact property taxes in some way if people want to continue to fund all the things that property taxes pay for.
I'll just tack one thing onto that. I think it's a really good point. And I've already had conversations with legislators in Oregon that are talking about closing the state revenue gap because of this through reducing shared service payments to local governments, right? So not a property tax impact, but we're talking about cutting the funds that are supporting economic development, public health, like, core local government functions in Oregon as a way of helping to keep people on the Oregon Health Plan, right? Keep people on Medicaid. So there's a lot of connection, as Aidan pointed out, amongst local and state revenues, even if state revenue systems aren't really, even if local revenue systems aren't really coupled directly to federal income tax laws.
Great. Thank you so much. I think answered in the chat was that we will be putting out something about 529 plans. So look for that. And, you should be all subscribing to ITEP's e-newsletters, and then you won't miss anything. Will ITEP also be modeling the impact or distribution of any of these other individual policies by state? Aidan?
Yeah, that's definitely like as requested. If you guys come to us, we're happy to work with you to figure that out for your states. Absolutely.
Great. Okay, thanks. We've got some other questions about like when these will all hit state revenue. I think some of this is a little bit like what Michael has already answered, but Massachusetts Department of Revenue is indicating that the biggest loss will come in 2026. Do you think that's true? And do you think it's true for the other breaks? I know that's a little similar to what you already talked about, Michael.
We'll see, again, certainly to the, with the bonus depreciation and the R&D, your bunch and the new bonus depreciation for factories, which, as I said, has never existed before. You're bunching a lot of potentially big deductions in the first year. So yeah, so there's this is going to, as Aidan said, this is going to start showing up in January in estimated corporate tax payments, and so and it may very well decline over. It probably will decline over time because you're bunching the deductions in the early years, which means they'll be lower in the later years.
Great.
That is going to be the typical pattern, but it's going to continue.
Yeah. There was a question which we may have to answer by email about why Mississippi and Alabama have decoupled from the QSBS, the Qualified Small Business Stock Deduction. We may have to answer that one by email. That was a question out of Ohio. As we wrap up here, we powered through a whole bunch of questions there. Look, here's the thing. There was just an enormous tax break passed at the federal level that, balloons our deficit and shifts resources from working class people, from regular people, from our schools, from our services, up to the wealthiest people in this country and to businesses. And we have an opportunity, I think, to take that on in your states. And so I'm just really grateful to this panel for putting some very concrete, seemingly detailed, wonky tools in front of you for ways that we can do this and make sure that our communities continue to get the things we need in the face of a federal government that really wants to deprive them of that. So huge thanks, Michael, Daniel, and Aidan, and we look forward to further questions by email from all of you, and we're just grateful for everybody's long attention spans and for being here today. Thank you very much.